Shirley Temple's daughter Lori remembers a smell. Wool and rosewater. Her mother's coat. Not the famous one. Not the fur from the magazine covers. Just a dark, ordinary coat that hung by the door every morning. Lori used to press her face into it before the day started. It was the softest place she knew. She remembers something else. A voice through a wall. Low, then loud, then low again. She was too young to understand the word argument. She thought it might be the radio. She thought it happened in all houses. She had nothing to compare it to, so she filed it under normal. What was actually happening on the other side of that wall, what John Agar was saying to Shirley Temple, what he was taking from her night after night while she was pregnant with Lori, that Lori would not understand for decades. One morning the coat was gone. Nobody said where. She spent years mourning it. She only understood much later that the coat leaving was not a loss. It was the first morning her mother was free. If this is your first time here, stay. This channel tells the real story, not the cleaned-up version. Subscribe before we go further. Before John Agar. Before the marriage. Before any of this. There was Shirley Temple, and if you think you know who she was, I want to slow you down because the version most people carry is incomplete in every way that matters. By 1935, Shirley Temple was the #1 box office star in Hollywood. Not the #1 child star. The #1 star, period, ahead of Clark Gable, ahead of Fred Astaire, ahead of every adult in the industry. She was 7 years old, and she was personally keeping 20th Century Fox from declaring bankruptcy. Her face was on lunchboxes, soap bars, paper dolls, and magazine covers in 17 countries. Her curls were trademarked. Her smile was a financial instrument. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, and I am quoting directly, "As long as our country has Shirley Temple, we will be all right." She made 9 teen films before she turned 10. According to records, she earned over $3 million during her childhood years, a staggering sum in Depression-era America. Money that should have secured her future. Money that, by the time she turned 21, her father had almost entirely spent. On what, exactly, was never fully accounted for. But here is the thing the numbers miss, the thing the lunchboxes miss, the thing even the movies miss. Shirley Temple could genuinely act. She had timing. She had wit. She had that specific, unrepeatable quality that exists in maybe one performer per generation, the ability to make an audience feel, through a screen, that she was looking at them personally. Critics who went in expecting to dismiss her came out leaning forward. She was not manufactured. She was real. But Hollywood in the 1940s had no idea what to do with her once she stopped being a child. Fox dropped her at 13. Other studios took smaller bets. The films shrank. The press began writing about her in the past tense while she was still a teenager. She was not finished. She had simply outgrown the cage they'd built for her. By the time she was 17, Shirley Temple had survived a childhood that would have leveled most adults. She had worked professionally since she was 3 years old. She had performed on command, smiled on command, been displayed and sold and traded for decades, and through all of it, she had maintained something private, something untouched, a self that was hers. She had been trained to perform composure she did not always feel. She had never been trained to recognize danger in the shape of a charming man. She was 17 years old when she met John Agar at a party in Los Angeles. He was 24. According to press accounts of the time, he was strikingly handsome, tall and dark-haired, with the kind of ease in a room that reads, "When you are young and haven't been burned yet," as confidence. He had no career to speak of. He was working as a physical training instructor for the Army Air Forces. He had no money of his own, no demonstrated talent, nothing except his looks and an instinct for finding the right rooms. But he had something no one had ever offered Shirley Temple before. He looked at her like she was just a girl, not a star, not a product, not America's sweetheart or a box office figure or a name attached to a merchandise line. Just a girl. A 17-year-old girl he wanted to take dancing. For someone who had been public property since she was 3, that felt like oxygen. Her parents approved immediately. The wedding took place on September 19, 1945, at Wilshire Methodist Church in Los Angeles. The papers covered it like a royal event. Shirley wore ivory satin. She carried gardenias. She was still 17 years old on the day she signed the marriage license. The first years looked like what she had hoped for. Their daughter Linda Susan was born in 1948. Shirley was 20 years old and, by the accounts of people who knew her then, genuinely happy. She planted a garden. She learned to cook. She was trying, for the first time in her life, to simply be home. Not performing. Not producing. Just living. She didn't see it yet. But the people around her would later say they saw it before she did. They said nothing because in 1940s Hollywood, a husband's behavior was the husband's business. The house began to change quietly, the way all dangerous changes happen. Gradually, then all at once. Lori, the second child, the one who would be born at the center of the worst of it, had not yet arrived. But somewhere in that house a clock was already running. There is a kind of quiet that descends over a household before everything breaks. It is not peaceful. A child who grows up inside it learns to read silence the way other children read weather. John Agar had a secret that a wedding ring could not fix. He drank. Not the way people drink at parties. Not the way actors drank in Hollywood. In the 40s, which was to say, extravagantly but functionally. John Agar drank the way that hollows a household from the inside. Slowly, consistently, in a way that begins invisible and ends undeniable. According to court records and newspaper accounts from the period, Agar was arrested multiple times for drunk driving in the late 1940s. These arrests were not private. They were in the papers. The man married to America's sweetheart was being photographed in police custody. Shirley Temple's name appeared in every article. Her reputation, the carefully maintained, nationally beloved reputation she had spent her entire career building, was in those column inches too, smeared and diminished, through no fault of her own. He also had affairs. According to accounts documented in Shirley's 1988 autobiography Child Star, Agar was openly unfaithful. He did not attempt to conceal it. That absence of concealment is its own message. It says, "Your feelings about this do not constitute a limit on my behavior." It says, "What you think of yourself is not my concern." Children notice everything. They understand nothing. Until later, what Lori would later carry, not as memories exactly, but as the felt sense of a childhood atmosphere, was not the facts. She was an infant and a toddler for most of the worst of it. What she absorbed was subtler and more lasting than facts. It was the texture of a house under pressure. The way her mother's body changed when she heard the front door. The particular quality of Tuesday evenings versus Saturday mornings. The way certain rooms felt different after he had been in them. She had no word for what she was registering. She didn't need one. The body keeps its own records. Here is what made John Agar genuinely dangerous, in the specific way that a child's later life is shaped by someone she barely remembers. It was not the explosions. It was the between times. The days when he was charming, easy, the man who had walked into that party and made 17-year-old Shirley Temple feel seen. Those days still happened, and their existence made the other days harder to name, for Shirley, for anyone watching, and later, in the most complicated way, for the daughter who grew up hearing a version of the story with all its edges sanded down. What no one saw from outside the house was what Agar was doing to Shirley Temple's understanding of herself. She had spent her entire childhood being told her value was contingent. On her smile. On the ringlets. On the box office. On being what someone else needed her to be. She had married, in part, to escape that transaction, to be loved for something other than her output. And she had walked from one transactional relationship directly into another. Except this one came with contempt instead of applause. Agar reportedly told people, publicly, without apparent embarrassment, that Shirley's career was finished, that she was a has-been, that he was not particularly moved by having married her. He said this while living in a home her name had paid for. He said this while she was pregnant with his child. The most sinister version of a man is not the one who rages. It is the one whose cruelty is comfortable. Agar's ease was the most frightening thing about him. He was not ashamed. He saw nothing to be ashamed of. What happened inside those rooms the child could not see. What it cost her mother, in ways that outlasted the marriage by decades, the child would spend most of her life trying to understand. There is a specific kind of stillness that belongs to mothers in crisis. It is not peaceful stillness. It is the stillness of a person running enormous calculations behind a face held deliberately calm, because there are children in the house and the children must not know the scale of what is happening. Lori would have been small enough that furniture was still enormous, that doorknobs were still at eye level, when she first learned to read that stillness in her mother's F.A. See, Shirley Temple at the kitchen table. Hands flat, eyes on something that wasn't in the room, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. What the child saw, her mother waiting. What was actually happening? According to accounts from the period, Agar had made news again. Another arrest. Another set of press photographs. Another morning of opening the paper and finding her marriage laid out for public consumption. She was in her mid-20s, she was carrying her second child, and she was sitting at a table doing what women in impossible situations have always done, calculating the arithmetic of staying versus leaving, measuring what each choice would cost her children, arriving at no clean answer. The child climbed into a chair nearby and watched her mother's hands on the table. She thought, she is far away. She didn't know how to bring her back. She didn't know that she couldn't. She sat very still, the way children sit when they understand, without having words for it, that the wrong movement will change the atmosphere in a room. She was learning a skill no child should have to learn. The child remembers a voice through a door not quite closed. Her mother's voice, but different. Stripped of its warmth, reduced to something careful and precise. The voice of a woman choosing every word because she knows that words can be repeated, distorted, used. That isn't what happened. For words, said quietly, firmly, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has said them before, to different people about different incidents, and has stopped expecting to be believed. What the child heard, her mother defending herself. What was actually happening? Agar had been talking. To friends, to industry people, to anyone who would provide an audience for his version of the marriage. According to accounts from the period, he was not discreet about his affairs. Not discreet about his contempt for Shirley's standing in Hollywood. Not discreet about anything. He was constructing a narrative in which his behavior was understandable and her response to it was the problem. Shirley Temple had spent her entire public life having other people narrate her. The studio, the press, her own parents. Now her husband was doing it. She stood in a room in her own house and defended the truth of her own experience to someone on the other end of a telephone line. The child stood in the hallway. She did not go in. She understood, in the way children understand things before they have language for them, that going in would cost her mother something. She learned, in that hallway, how to make herself small. That is not a skill that disappears when the crisis does. It becomes a habit. It becomes a body's default setting. It takes years to unlearn, and some people never do. One evening. She doesn't know how old she was, only that the furniture was still large, that she had to climb to get onto things. Lori went looking for her mother and found her sitting alone in a room with the light not quite all the way on. No book, no radio, nothing in her hands. She climbed up beside her. Her mother's arm came around her without her looking. Automatic, the motion so practiced it lived in muscle rather than intention. The motion of someone who had held this child so many times that the holding required no thought. They sat. Lori leaned into her and felt her breathe. She thought, I should do something. She put her small hand over her mother's hand. Pressed down. As if pressure itself could communicate what she had no words for. Her mother looked down at her. And whatever was in her face in that moment, the love, the exhaustion, the determination to protect this child from the full weight of what was happening, Lori held it. Filed it in the place where children store the things that matter before they understand why they matter. She could not fix what was wrong. She was 4 years old, or 3 or 2, too small to do anything except be present. And being present was, it too. RNS out, exactly what her mother needed. The child could not have known that. She tried anyway. That is what children do. They try with their bodies, with their presence, with the only currency they have. Just being there. It is never enough to fix anything. It is always enough to matter. The child needed to hear someday that it mattered. She waited a long time for that. Shirley Temple filed for divorce in December of 1949. The court records are public. She cited mental cruelty, the legal language California provided in 1949 for describing what her marriage had become. 2 words. Mental cruelty. Standing in for years. She was 21 years old. Lori was not yet born when the filing was finalized. She entered the world in April of 1952 into what should have been, and in many ways was, a different life. Shirley had married Charles Black in 1950, and that marriage, by every account and every record available, was genuinely different. Equal. Kind. Built on mutual respect rather than one person's consumption of another. They stayed together until Charles Black's death in 2005, 55 years. So Shirley got out. She got free. That part of the story is real and it matters. But freedom, when it arrives after damage, does not arrive clean. It arrives with the damage still inside it. The eroded confidence, the recalibrated expectations, the specific internal work of a woman who trusted her own judgment, was catastrophically wrong, and now has to decide whether to trust it again. That work does not complete itself on the day the divorce is filed. It is the work of years, sometimes decades. Lori grew up with a mother who was free, and with a mother who was still, in certain rooms, in certain moments, quietly doing that work. There were mornings when her mother looked at something just past the edge of the room. The child learned not to ask what she was looking at. Some distances, she understood, were not hers to cross. This loss moves differently. It moves through a child's life not as a single event but as a slow accumulation of small moments. A pause in a conversation. A look exchanged over a child's head. The careful way adults change the subject when a name comes up. During the years of her marriage to Agar, Shirley Temple's name had been attached to scandal. Drunk driving arrests, reported affairs, public court proceedings. The newspapers ran it all. And the way the press framed it, with the casual cruelty of an era that did not have language for what was actually happening, was never about what had been done to her. It was about the failure of the fairy tale. As if Shirley Temple had broken a contract with the public by marrying a man who turned cruel. She was blamed, in 1,000 small ways, for being unable to hold together something that had been rotten from inside. That narrative did not disappear when the marriage ended. It persisted, as these narratives do, as the thing people knew when her name came up. A slight shift in the air. A subject changed a beat too quickly. Lori grew up inside that. Too young to understand its origins. Old enough to feel its texture. She carried, without knowing she was carrying it, the weight of something that was never her mother's fault and certainly never hers. The shame of a scandal she had no part in creating. The ambient sense, absorbed before she had the vocabulary to question it, that her family had something to apologize for. Some things a child understands without being told. One of them is, we don't discuss that. Another is, the reason we don't discuss it lives in exactly the silence we're keeping. This is the loss that can be counted, which makes it no less devastating. Shirley Temple had earned a fortune in her childhood. Over $3 million by the accounting available, an immense sum in Depression-era America, a sum that should have provided absolute financial security for the rest of her life. It was gone before she turned 21. Her father's management, his decisions, his spending, documented in Shirley's own account in ChildStar, had liquidated it. The specifics were never fully disclosed. She entered marriage to Agar not as a wealthy woman but as a young woman whose extraordinary earnings had already been spent by someone else. Already robbed once. And Agar contributed nothing. He lived on her residual income, her maintained public profile, whatever film work she could find as Hollywood decided she was aging out of relevance. And he spent it with the ease of a man who had no concept of what it had cost her to earn it. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings of a high-profile divorce in 1940s Los Angeles were not inexpensive. The lawyers, the press management, the financial settlement. By the time Shirley Temple closed the door on John Agar, she had been financially stripped twice in the first 20 years of her life. First by her parents, then by her husband. Lori grew up in a stable household. Charles Black was an honest provider and a genuine partner. She did not grow up in want. But stability is not the same as the security her mother should have had. The cushion that should have existed, the $3 million worth of a childhood, and whatever remained of a young woman's earning years was simply not there. The arithmetic of what should have been versus what was is one of those calculations children feel in the texture of daily life without being able to name the variable they're missing. She had a childhood. It was smaller than it should have been. Not in ways she could measure, in ways she felt. This is the hardest loss to name because it is not an absence. Shirley Temple was present. She was there. She raised Lori. She was, by all available accounts, a devoted and attentive mother, warm, structured, genuinely invested in her children's lives. The loss was not her presence. The loss was the version of her that had existed before John Agar got close enough to work on her. Consider what Shirley Temple had survived intact before him. A childhood that would have destroyed most people. Decades of being owned and managed and sold. The loss of an enormous fortune before she was old enough to stop it. Being dropped by her studio at 13 and rebuilding. All of that, and she arrived at 17 with her essential self still in her. The wit, the warmth, the specific and irreplaceable quality that made people feel seen. Agar worked on that. Slowly. In the way that people with contempt work on the people they've decided are beneath them. The dismissals, the infidelities, the public humiliations, the casual cruelty of a man who lived on her money while telling the world her career was finished. Each of these was a small subtraction. Individually survivable. Collectively erosive. She survived. She rebuilt genuinely, impressively in ways we will come to. But she was rebuilt, not restored. The woman on the other side of that marriage was not the same woman who had walked into it. She was stronger in certain ways and quieter in others. There were rooms in her she kept closed. Lori grew up with a mother she loved and knew, and with the unnameable sense of reaching toward something in her mother that was not quite reachable. A warmth that was real, but that had a guarded quality underneath it. A woman who gave enormously and held something back, not because she didn't love her children, but because holding something back was the survival strategy she had learned, and survival strategies, once installed, do not uninstall cleanly. You cannot mourn a version of your mother you never met, but you feel her shape in the spaces she should have occupied. She loved her mother completely. She sometimes had the feeling, one she could not explain and certainly could not name when she was a child, that she was reaching for someone who was standing right there. She reached her whole life. She never stopped. Lori Black grew up to be a musician. In the 1980s and early 1990s, she played bass in the Melvins, a cult heavy metal and punk band from the Pacific Northwest, with an almost mythological standing in the underground music world. She went by the name Lorax. By any visible measure, she had found something entirely her own. A sound, a community, an identity with no connection whatsoever to the curls and dimples and tap shoes that the world associated with her mother's name. On the surface, it looks like escape. But the things we carry don't care about surfaces. Lori struggled, seriously, over years in ways that are documented in multiple published accounts. With addiction, with instability, with periods of homelessness that are extraordinary to read about given who her mother was. She was the daughter of one of the most recognizable women in American history, and she lived, for stretches of her adult life, in conditions that reflected none of that inheritance except its psychological damage. I want to be careful here because it would be wrong, and it would be too easy, to draw a straight line from John Agar's behavior to Lori's adult struggles. Human lives are not that simple. Her story is her own. The causes are her own. But it is also not possible to look at what was laid down in that household. The fear absorbed before language, the maternal exhaustion carried in muscle memory, the ambient shame of a family scandal she had no part in making, and pretend it left no mark. The body keeps records. Lori grew up believing a version of her mother's story that had been carefully edited for her protection. This is what parents do. They redact. They simplify. They say, your father and I were not right for each other. They do not say, he tormented me while I was carrying you. He spent money I earned and told people my career was finished. He humiliated me in newspapers and in private, and I stayed longer than I should have because I was afraid of what leaving would cost you. They don't say that, because they are protecting the child. And the child grows up with a gap. Not empty. filled with whatever the child's imagination and instincts and the ambient texture of the household provides. Filled, often, with something heavier than the truth would have been, because imagined dangers are worse than named ones. What Lori was told: her parents' marriage hadn't worked. Her father had problems. Her mother had moved on and built a better life. What was true? All of that, and also something that lives underneath all of it. Something about what it costs a woman to be publicly humiliated while pregnant. Something about what it costs a child to grow up in the aftermath of damage that no one will put a name to. Something about how the silence we keep to protect the people we love can become the most heavy thing in the house. She reached adulthood carrying a weight she could not fully identify. That is its own particular kind of suffering. To be in pain without a clear origin story. To reach for something without knowing what you're reaching for. I found an account, written about Lori in later years, describing what her life had looked like at its lowest points. Reading it, I had to put it down for a moment. This was a real child, in a real house, listening to a real voice through a wall that she thought was the radio. This happened. Some things a person carries for decades before they understand where they picked them up. The weight feels like your own. It takes a long time to understand that it belonged to someone else first. That it was handed to you before you were old enough to put it down. The record of Lori Black's inner life is not fully available to us. What we have are the public documents. Shirley Temple's divorce filing from December 1949. The arrest records. The newspaper coverage spanning years. The 1988 autobiography Child Star. 300 pages of carefully controlled account. Written by a woman who had spent her entire life learning to narrate herself under pressure. And who was choosing, and now, exactly how much to give. And we have the thing that every adult child of a damaged marriage eventually arrives at, if they're fortunate. The day the story stops being the version you were handed and becomes the version you assembled yourself from the evidence. That day doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers. First a fact. Then the fact shifts over time from the intellectual part of you into the lower part, the part that understands things physically, emotionally, in the body. A date in a court filing becomes a woman sitting at a kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface. A newspaper headline becomes what it costs to read it. The word pregnant in an account of Agar's behavior becomes the specific, unbearable weight of carrying a child in a house where you are being diminished daily. Lori would have read the words mental cruelty in the divorce filing and understood. As an adult, as a woman, as a person who had lived enough of her own life to know what that phrase is standing in for, what those two words actually meant. What they were containing. How much had to happen before a woman in 1949 would use them in a legal document. And she would have gone back, the way we all go back, to the earliest things in herself. The coat. Hung by the door every morning. Dark wool. Rose water. The thing that meant her mother was there and the day was in its right order and everything was going to be navigable. Gone one morning. No explanation. She had filed it all those years ago in the column marked loss. Something safe had disappeared and no one said where. What she understood reading those records as an adult was that she had the column wrong. The coat left because her mother packed it. Because Shirley Temple had finally, at 21 years old, done what she should have been able to do years earlier. Gathered her children and her courage and walked out a door she had been afraid to walk through. Not for her own sake but for theirs. The coat was in a different house because her mother was finally safe. The loss she had spent years quietly carrying was actually a rescue. She had been mourning the morning her mother got free. That is what late understanding costs. That is the specific grief of it. Not that you didn't know, children can't know, and they shouldn't have to, but that you spent years with the wrong story installed in your body. Years feeling the shape of something as a wound that was actually a door opening. Years reaching toward an absence that was, in fact, the beginning of something better. When the right story finally arrives, it doesn't cancel the grief. Transforms it. The loss is still real. The confusion was still real. The years of carrying the wrong weight were real. But underneath all of it, something shifts. She spent years mourning a coat. The coat was her mother choosing her. The adult holds the child's memory up to the adult knowledge, and for a moment, just a moment, both are true at once. The child's confusion, the adult's understanding. The gap between them is not distance. It is time. It is the cost of growing up inside a story that no one was allowed to tell you yet. That cost is real. That it was necessary does not make it smaller. But there is something on the other side of it. When you understand, truly understand, in the body that what you thought was abandonment was actually protection, something releases. Not everything, not all at once, but something. The child finally understood. Her mother had been brave enough to go, and she had taken her children with her. Here is what the record shows about Shirley Temple. Not the movie poster version. The actual one. She was 17 years old when she married John Agar. 17, legally an adult in California in 1945, technically, but a 17-year-old who had spent her entire existence being managed by other people, who had been performing composure since she was 3, who had never had the kind of ordinary adolescence. That builds the instincts you need to recognize what's coming before it arrives. She had survived everything that came before him. The childhood labor, the money taken by her own family, being discarded by her studio at 13. She had arrived at 17 with something remarkable intact. An intelligence, a warmth, a sense of herself. And she had walked it directly into the path of a man who saw it as something to diminish. She stayed through things. She documented herself years later, in language that is careful and measured precisely because the emotions behind it are not. She stayed through the public arrests, through the open affairs, through the condescension so confident it didn't bother to hide itself. She stayed while she was pregnant, when leaving feels most impossible and staying feels most like protection. Then she left, 21 years old, filed the papers herself, named the cruelty in the only language the courts provided, took her daughter, carried her second child, and stepped through a door. And then, this is the part of the story that gets buried under the scandal, the part one want to hold up to the light. She built something extraordinary. She married Charles Black in December of 1950. That marriage was, by every account from every person who knew them, the real thing. Not symbolism, not transaction, not a young woman's desperate reach for someone who would see her as a person. It was a genuine partnership between two adults who respected each other, and it lasted 55 years, until his death in 2005. She raised 3 children. She was present for them. She gave them, according to every account available, a childhood structured by genuine love. Not the performed, monetized, publicly managed version of love she herself had received, but the real and private kind. And then she did something that almost no one expected and almost everyone has since forgotten. She became a diplomat. Shirley Temple Black. She took his name legally, served as the United States representative to the United Nations. She was appointed United States ambassador to Ghana in 1974. She served as the first female chief of protocol of the United States. She brought to that work the same qualities she had always had. The intelligence, the warmth, the specific skill of making a person feel that she was genuinely, particularly attending to them. The girl with the ringlets, the studio's most profitable property. The 17-year-old bride who married badly and was publicly humiliated and quietly survived. She went on to represent her country on the world stage. That is not an asterisk on her story. That is the story. What was taken from her was time. The years of her early adulthood, the years that should have been expansive, exploratory, full of the particular freedom of a young woman discovering who she is, were spent instead in a house that was slowly coming apart. The confidence she should have been building was being taken apart piece by piece. The money she should have had was already gone. Spent first by her father and then by a husband who treated her income as his inheritance. What she gave her children, after all of it, was the version of herself that had come through. Not undamaged. Nobody comes through something like that undamaged. But herself. The essential thing, the warmth, the attention, the quality of genuine presence, that survived. She gave that to Lori. Every day in the specific unremarkable ways that constitute a childhood. The arm that came around without looking because it had come around so many times the motion lived in muscle. The attention that arrived fully. The voice that meant, I am here. I see you. You are what matters. Lori grew up knowing that. Not always in her mind. Sometimes only in her body. But she knew it. What the child wants the world to know after all of this is simpler than you might expect. Not that her mother was wronged, though she was specifically and seriously, and On the public record. Not that John Agar was cruel, though he was, and the evidence is not ambiguous. Not that the system failed Shirley Temple, though it did in every way available to it. Just this: her mother was not the cautionary tale. She was not the proof that fame destroys. She was not the sad story of a child star who married badly and struggled. She was not what happened to her. She was who she was underneath all of it. The real thing. Before the curls were styled for the camera and after the cameras were gone. In the garden she planted. In the kitchen she learned to cook in. In the quiet room where she sat with her arm around her daughter without looking. Because her body knew what her daughter needed before she consciously thought of it. She was that. Lori remembers the coat. Wool and rosewater. The weight of it. The smell that meant morning. Order. She is here. The day is navigable. She remembers the arm. Automatic. Warm. The motion of someone who has held this child so many times that the holding requires no thought. It is simply what her body does when this child is near. She remembers the sound of her mother breathing in a room that was, for that one moment, quiet. Not performing. Not managing. Not being America's sweetheart or a box office number or a studio property or a scandal in a newspaper or a cautionary tale. Just breathing. Just there. That was the real thing. That was what no one could reach. That is what Lori Black carries still.